So I would like to welcome everyone once again to our QDigitizing webinar. And of course, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Steve Freeman, who's based in Phoenix. He is one of the managing partners at QDigitizing, where they focus on providing embroidery digitizing services to the North American market. So Steve, today's topic, as we've discussed, is tips, tricks, and applications for stock embroidery lettering. I'd like to start with you giving us a little summary of what that is, and then we'll take it from there.
Okay. Hey, good morning, everybody. So one of the questions that I get asked quite frequently at QDigitizing from our customers is how to add stock lettering to designs. All of you folks out there who have embroidery software typically have the ability to add personalization, keyboard lettering, alphabets to your designs, or sometimes all you want to do is add a name. You don't necessarily want to add stock lettering to a design. However, they're all kind of part of the same thing. So I've answered this question so many times that I thought it might make for a good webinar topic. So that's what we're going to talk about today.
Okay, fantastic. So Steve, is this software specific? Is it specific to one particular brand, or is this something that people can do no matter what brand they're working with?
So for today's demonstration, unfortunately, this is going to be software specific. The reason being is all of the major software providers out there, be it Wilcom, Pulse, Melco, Ethos, all of them have their own version of what I'm about to show you. Unfortunately, I can't show all of them at one time. I can only work with one brand of software at a time. So the demonstration that I'm showing you today is on Melco Design Shop, and this is version number 12. It's actually Melco's most recent version of the software. However,
right. So forgive me, just to understand, it is we're doing a demonstration on Melco, but all of the software would have their own version of exactly what you're doing.
That's correct. And I've worked with all of the big software providers, and all of the interfaces, while they look different, they all have similar features. So it really just becomes understanding in your software which button you need to push and where, but they can all do the exact same thing. And when we start to talk about some of the issues that involve quality with your stock lettering, those features are definitely there, and you need to know how to use them.
Fantastic. That's good to know. Okay, let's start with some basic lettering concepts then, Steve. Please give us a little overview. I know we're going to talk about kerning, trimming considerations, underlays. Let's get going with the basic lettering concepts.
Okay, so we're going to run through, to start with, the very basic of the basics. We're just going to enter a name. Now, I'm going to start with a name that I know is going to present some challenges right from the start. So we're just going to put up a name called Tony Taylor. Okay.
Right.
Now go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah, Tony Taylor.
So the reason that I've chose Tony Taylor is, after doing this for such a long time, I've always found that I don't like the way that capital T's are placed next to their lowercase companions. And so the amount of space that is between two letters, that's called kerning. So when you look at Tony Taylor, the T appears to be too far away from the O, or in this case, it seems to be too far away from the A. Now, I'm not going to get too deep into
why is that, Steve? Because I thought that all letters should be equally spaced. Why does it look different?
It looks different because the software engineers have created it this way. The kerning is actually technically correct in that the edge of the T right here is the same amount of space to the edge of the O as this O is to the edge of this N. But it doesn't look that way because the top of the T is so far away from the O. So the kerning technically is probably correct, but visually it doesn't look right. So all of the software applications have several different ways to correct this, and there are shortcuts, and there are good ways, and there are bad ways. But the easiest way is just your lettering will typically have a handle, and you can actually grab your letters and move them left or right. Now, the problem with that is once you do that, what we've done here is we've made the space between these two words too big. There's too much
Exactly.
space there, and it just doesn't look good. So if you were to fix this manually, you would have to go in and move you'd have to go in and move all of these letters manually. And at that point, your kerning is really going to be messed up because you're just doing it by eyeball. So let's just go back. I'm just using the undo tool in my software to get me back to where we were. Okay,
Got it.
so this is the unedited letter. So we're going to open up a dialog box. And again, all of your software applications will have dialog boxes similar to this that will allow you to kind of get down into the nitty gritties of what we're doing. So
Okay,
I'm going
let's
to
fix this T.
go ahead.
Okay, let's fix this T. Let's see how you're going to do it, Steve.
Okay, so the Melco software, and I know for a fact that Willcom and Pulse both do the same thing, is I can add what are called negative spaces between the letters. So if I put my cursor inside the word Tony, then I can add some negative spaces just by clicking here. And then I'm going to add some negative spaces here. Okay, now if I apply these changes on the screen, you'll see that those are more visually properly kerned. Now, if I don't like the way that looks visually, I can remove a space and then I can apply it. And I can do the same on the other side and then apply that. Maybe that looks a little bit better visually. Now, I still have an issue where the amount of space that's between the word Tony and Taylor is too much. So I can apply the same type of theory between two words, and I can apply negative spaces there. I can apply it, and then those words are going to move much closer together.
So it brings the entire words together without losing the right space in between the letters.
That is correct. And this is kerning in a nutshell. And again, there's more than one way to get to the finish line. And I've just learned from years of doing this how many negative spaces are needed between letters. So I can actually type these in, and then I go in and I quickly add negative spaces to bring everything closer together. Now, I certainly don't want to disparage other people's work, and that's not my point in showing this to you, but I see personalization out on the street all the time. I might be at my mechanic shop, or I might be at the grocery store, it doesn't matter, but somebody might be wearing a uniform shirt and it's been personalized, and I can tell in 1 second if the person who did the personalization knew what they were doing, because they either knew how to adjust for the kerning or they didn't. And it's readily apparent when it's not done correctly.
Yes. All right. Brilliant. So we've talked about kerning. What about trimming considerations? Steve, should we move on?
Sure. Let's move on quickly. And everybody who might be out there, if you have questions, I'm going through this very quickly right now. We'll take questions at the end. So if you want to ask me any questions, please feel free. So let's go ahead and talk about trimming real quick. So all of you out there, you know, it's 2024 now, have machines that do auto trimming. Right now, you can see on these letters that there doesn't appear to be any trimming. Well, the reason for that is I've created letters that are 1 inch tall. Okay, so what that means is, oops, let's go back to the right thing. I apologize. What that means is since the letters are so big, there's so much space between the letters that the software recognizes that it's going to put in auto trims. But let's say that we made these letters only 0.25 inches tall, 1/4 inch. So let me apply that. And then I'm going to zoom in so we can see these letters again. So now that these are 1/4 inch letters, you can see that between each of the letters, there is a thread trim. So if I turn on a 3D view, now you can see it very clearly. Okay, so if you want to add trims to your letters, again, all the software applications typically have a place to put in a trim. So if I go to this space with my cursor and I click the little button that looks like a scissors, then I can put in a trim. And then if I go to the next letter, do the same thing. This will auto trim between the words because the space is so great, so you don't have to worry about a trim there. And then if we move over here, put in a trim, 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 trim. I apply it. Let me move this window out of the way. Oops, I must have forgotten one there. Apply it. Now you'll see that this design is going to fully trim.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Well, that looks very clear, very sharp now. So is there anything else that we should be talking about when we talk about trimming?
Well, the other aspect of trimming is, a lot of people will want to do what's called close point connections. And what close point connections is, your software will automatically figure out the closest point between two letters, and it will actually put a connector stitch. In this case, in the O, it would be right here. And we're not going to get into close point connection today because that can be a webinar all on its own.
Right.
And it depends greatly on the type of font that you want to use, which we'll get into in a little while too. But you don't have to put in auto trims if you don't want to. I'm just trying to show you how to do it if you want to.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, should we move into underlays? Because I can see we've got 3 different areas: center walk, zigzag, edge walk to talk about when it comes to underlays. Shall we crack on?
And to do underlays, I'm going to go back to, just so they show up better, I am going to bring my letters back up to 1 inch tall. I'm only doing this because it will just display better for us. Okay. And let's make it fit the window. And let me turn off our 3D stitches. And now let's go ahead and zoom into one specific letter. This way we can see it. And let's bring up our wonderful window again. So in here, we have a choice for underlays. So let's click on that. I'm going to disable auto underlays, and I'm going to walk you through very quickly the different types of underlays that are available to you.
Okay, so if we're looking at underlay, shall we start off with the center walk?
Yes.
Fantastic. Center walk.
So what a center walk underlay does, and folks, you'll have to forgive me, for some reason my software is making a mistake and it's applying an edge walk underlay, which I don't want, and I don't know why it's doing it. So I'm going to do something here very quickly.
All right. Technology meant to be your friend, but sometimes.
Folks, there actually seems to be a glitch on my software, and it's not allowing me to adjust my underlays. And instead of trying to hunt and peck and fix this while people are watching, I don't know what's going on. This is kind of embarrassing, folks. For some reason, my software is not working properly.
Well, as I said, technology is meant to be your friend, Steve, but sometimes it just does not do as we want it to do.
Nope, something is definitely amiss here. So we're going to skip over underlay right now, and let's move into pull compensation.
Okay, pull compensation it is.
Okay, so pull compensation is a technique.
How do you define pull compensation, Steve?
Pull compensation is a technique that's used in embroidery to adjust for the natural push and pull that is in fabrics. Now, depending on the fabric that you're stitching on, you might need more or less pull compensation. What pull compensation, it does 2 things, okay? If you look at my letters here, the width of the column, if there's no pull compensation added whatsoever, the column width, that's the point from here to here,
Yeah.
that has zero pull compensation. One other part of pull compensation is the letters might actually appear to be a little bit taller or a little bit shorter than their neighbor letter. The reason for that is round letters like an E will pull in, and a straight letter like a V will push out. So what the software engineers have done is they have put in some natural pull compensation, and that's why it looks like the letter E is a little bit below this blue baseline, and the letter V is on top of the baseline. When my name actually stitches out, it will actually stitch on the same baseline. So the problem that I've found over the years is the amount of pull compensation that is programmed into stock lettering, the alphabets, it's not enough. So what we want to do, what I mean by not enough, is when you actually stitch this out, it will be too thin on your apparel. The letters will look weak and they just won't look very good. So what we want to do is add some pull compensation. In this case, we're going to use percent values. I found that as a starting point, I like to do 115% full compensation. Okay, so you'll see when I hit the apply button, you'll notice that the column widths are going to appear to get fatter. Okay, can you all see, what just happened there? If I go forward and back, you can kind of see how the letters appear to get wider and thinner.
Precisely.
So this is no pull compensation. This is 15% pull compensation. If I kind of want to go crazy, so I could really
yes, but
add to that, this is 50% full compensation. This is, oops. This is no pull compensation, 50%, none, that's 50%. Okay, but again, this actually
know what to do exactly, what percentage is right.
So what I found is different fabrics will require different levels of pull compensation, but I've just found that no matter what, some pull compensation will always be needed. So, and the amount of pull compensation is different depending on the type of font that you do. So right now we're just using a good old-fashioned basic block. But if we go into something, let's say, like a Times New Roman, so we're going to change that. This lettering style here, by the way, look at how messed up this kerning is, okay? So I would definitely go in and fix that.
So again, kerning is specific to the font as well, as we can see.
Oh, absolutely, especially when you start working with script fonts. And again, during question and answers, we can go through that. This is the type of topic where it seems very easy on the surface, but you can get down into the weeds very, very quickly. Okay. So I'm trying to avoid an overly technical conversation and show you the important tools that you need in order to be able to create quality stock lettering. Okay, so let me go, I'm going to go back to this just because it's easy to see, okay? And I'm going to put the full compensation, okay, it's back to 115%, which is what I wanted. Now, I'm going to move on to the next consideration, which is equally important to full compensation, which is your density considerations.
Right.
Density goes hand in hand with pull compensation.
Okay, what's the difference between density and the pull compensation then?
Okay, let me zoom in.
Because I understand that pull compensation is, from one edge of the letter to the other edge of the letter.
That's correct.
And what would be density?
Density is the amount of space that's actually between your stitches. So this is a graphic representation of what your needle will actually form on your garment. So the amount of space that's between two stitches right here, this is density. Okay, so if we go if we go to our letters and we go back up here and we go into density, you'll see that, again, the software engineers, based on their expertise, have put in a default density, which is what we're looking at on the screen. If I stitch out a sample and I believe that the design seems to be either too sparse or too dense, then I can add or take out density, based on whatever I determine it to be. Now, one thing that's a little bit tricky here is it's a reverse relationship, okay? So if I make this 150% density and then I apply it, you'll see the stitches actually get further apart, which may be what you wanted to do. But when you stitch this out on your fabric, it will be the stitching will be more sparse. So in this case, if I want to add density, I actually want to go the other way, and you'll see that the stitches are closer together.
So smaller stitches or smaller density brings the stitches closer together, you're saying?
Right. So, and one way that you can see this very easily is, let me drag down this window right here. So this actually shows how many stitches are in your design at any given time. So let's go back. So notice right now, the stitch count on this design is 3,142. So if I change this density to 150 and then I apply it, look, the stitch count, look what happened to stitch count. It went down to 1,051 stitches. So in the same amount of space, we lost 2,000 stitches, okay? So you can imagine the same design in the same amount of space with 2,000 less stitches is going to have, it's going to appear very
visual. Exactly.
Conversely, if we change this to 75 and I hit apply, now it's 3,142 stitches. If we go to 100%, which is default, it's 1,922. So you can very clearly see how density impacts the stitch count in the design.
Brilliant. All right, that makes sense. And what about line spacing, Steve?
Okay, so let's go back. I'm going to create some new letters here. Let's go back to Tony Taylor. Make them fit the screen. Let's open up our dialog box. And let's say that Tony Taylor is the head chef at some restaurant, okay? So you can see here now that we have 2 lines of text. It's very poorly kerned, but the line spacing appears to be okay. Now, we can adjust the line spacing, which is an important concept. So if we click here on spacing, the line spacing is 150%. What that means is the amount of space between the bottom of this letter and the top of this letter is 50% the size of whatever the capital letters here. So since I know I'm working with 1-inch letters, the amount of space between here and here is a 1/2 inch. But what you need to be very careful of is if your alphabets have any descenders, like a Y or a J, okay? Because you can bring these lines closer together by saying, I only want 125% line spacing, okay? And then you can see that your lines have come much closer together.
But the Y is now touching the H.
Right, but what can always be interesting is, let's say that maybe you like that. Remember, we can add in our backspaces, okay? And now look at that. So again, the more that you start to work with your stock lettering, you can see how all these changes that you can make dramatically impact what your final result will be. Okay. So
what if we wanted to have an image in there with Tony Taylor at the top and say head chef at the bottom? Can you do something like that?
And you wanted to add a design to it?
Yeah, let's say the logo, there's a round logo in there, and I wanted Tony to be curved at the top and head chef curved at the bottom.
Okay, let me show you that in just one second, Wilford. Let me address one other issue before we go there. Okay, so let's say that we're going to be putting this design onto a cap. Now, everybody knows, or I shouldn't say that, but it's a general rule in embroidery when you're stitching on a cap that you should stitch from the bottom up and center out. Well, the software will allow you to do that with just a couple of clicks. Okay, so when I want to click this button right here. Well, before we do that, let me just show you. So right now, this is how these letters will actually stitch. Okay, so we're starting on the top line and we're stitching from left to right. Okay, and then we're going to move down to the bottom line and we're going to stitch from left to right. On a cap, this is not ideal. Okay, so how can we fix that? We in this Melco software, we have the horizontal stitch order, and I know that this is available in WillCom and Pulse too. We'll click on this button right here. You can see two arrows pointing out, opposing each other. And then we have this vertical stitch order. And if we click on this button right here, it's going to start at the bottom and it's going to show center out. So if I apply that,
center out,
and then I click here, you'll see it's starting on the bottom line. And it's going to show stitch center out. So this is exactly what we want to see for a cap, everybody. Okay, now somebody might say to yourself, well, why don't you just do it that way all the time? Well, the reason for that is when you do bottom up and center out, it often adds a whole bunch of trims that you may or may not want. And too many trims equals too much time on the machine. Too much time on the machine equals money. Time is money in this case. Right. So trimming is a beautiful thing, but you don't want to do more of it than you have to. Okay, so with that part of it out of the way, if you want to add text to a design, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy this, and then I'm going to go to a design that I've saved here, and I'm going to paste this text into this design. Okay. Right. So this is just an embroidery design that I had kind of waiting for us today, and I'm going to add some text to it.
Right.
Now, once we have this text brought into the design, it's very simple just to grab it and move it around. This text is too big for this design, so I can certainly resize these letters. Okay. We'll make them 1/2-inch letters. We'll apply that. So these letters got much smaller.
Yeah.
And now we can add them there. So, I mean, this is great and it works nice and it looks okay, but maybe you want to get a little bit fancier. So let me show you some of the fancier things that you can do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this. I select it, I hit Control C, and then I'm going to paste it, Control V, and now I have an exact copy of these letters. Okay.
Good.
So now on the bottom letters, I'm going to take off the name Tony Taylor. I'm just going to delete it.
Now
we're just going to keep head chef. I'm going to apply it. Okay. And now on the top text, I'm going to select it and I'm going to take off head chef. I'm going to apply it. Okay. Let me move this out of the way. And so now I'm just going to center that. So again, this looks really good. We're starting to dial into a design that is using a stock design, which is the smiley face, and we're going to use stock lettering to personalize. Okay, well, and this all looks great, but what else can we do to these letters? I can select these letters, and I can do things like I can place these letters on an arc. Okay, so you'll see here that I changed from a straight line to an arc. And I can apply that. And so now these letters will be arched over the top. We can move these into place. And then all the different softwares have handles that you can grab. And you can make those letters follow.
So now it loops at the top.
Right. And it'll follow the arch of the curve. Okay. And so then you can play with that visually. You can play with that until you get it exactly the way you want it. We can do the same thing with head chef across the bottom. We can change this to an arc and we
Right.
can apply it. Oh, but look what happened
So
there.
we
We
do
don't
the
want
opposite
that.
way.
So what we want to do is we want it to go the other way. So we can change it to
Counterclockwise.
counterclockwise letters. Oh, but now it's upside down. So what we do is we change the angle of where that lettering comes in to 180 degrees, and we apply it, and there
There
you
you
go.
go.
So now we have Tony Taylor head chef. We can manually move this up into place, and again we can use our handles to get that, to dial it into exactly to where we want. Now again, we can, talking about, getting maybe a little bit fancier, we can change our fonts on top or bottom or anywhere to be different. It just depends on what alphabets you have available to you. So let's say, excuse me, I want to do a script name instead of let's do, this one looks good. So we'll change Tony's name to a script. Now you can see where things like, you have to now start messing with your spacing and your kerning to get things to be exactly how you want them. So these words are too close together, so we can take that out. So now we have space there. We can take a little bit of space out here, a little bit of space out here, and maybe we even want these letters to be a little bit bigger on top, so we can emphasize his name over his title.
Okay.
And, there you go. So you might want to say at this point, I have a finished design, and it just kind of depends on what you are trying to accomplish with your stock alphabets and or your stock designs.
Well, what I can see here, as you've mentioned before, I mean, the fonts matter. Everything that you're doing, kerning, pull compensation, it all will change depending on the type of fonts that you're going to use as well. Steve, we are now moving into our Q&A segment. So I'd like to invite our participants to please raise your hands, your digital hands, raise your digital hands, and I will try to get to you as quickly as possible if you'd like to ask a question. Any questions out there? People are a little quiet today. Okay, let me see. Scanning, scanning, scanning. We haven't got any questions as yet. Let me see. Q&A. We've got our first question, and you can ask your question, please. All right. They've written one. It says, what is the minimum letter height you would recommend, Steve? What is the minimum letter height?
So minimum letter height, that is an excellent question, is oftentimes going to be determined by the alphabet or the font itself. Some letters can go very small, and then some letters need some size to them where they're not going to stitch very well. And it all depends on, I shouldn't say it all depends, but a great deal depends on if there's any serifs in the font. So let's go back here where it's not quite as busy. Okay. And if we look at, this is just a basic block, there are no serifs. That means it is a sans serif font. This can go down as small as 0.20 inches or 4 millimeters. Okay. Now, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And if you are going to go that small, then you really need to know how to add or how to do, first of all, to do your pull compensations and your densities, and you really have to take into account the fabric that you're stitching on. You can do 0.20 letters, 4 millimeter letters. However, the smaller you go, the more you're going to have to adjust for your pull compensation and densities. The other thing that very much, excuse me, needs to be considered is if there are any serifs in your text. Okay, so by serifs, this is Times New Roman. You have these little, all these little bars and fancy little features that are in your letters.
Right.
As a general rule, the more serifs that you have, the larger your letters need to be to stitch well. That really is the operant phrase. You can make these letters 0.25 or 1/4 inch, okay? But the problem is you get so much detail in such a small place that it's just physically not going to stitch well. So, if I'm going to offer somebody advice, or if they send us artwork and it's very, very fancy font, then it may not work very well at a small size. And I might have to tell them, I know you want a Times New Roman font, but from an embroidery standpoint, an Arial font is going to work much better at a small size. When you get into large letters, you can pretty much, go crazy.
All right.
Make whatever you want.
Okay, fantastic. Any other questions? Any other questions? We've got a silent audience today. What's going on, Steve?
I don't know.
Right then, if we haven't got any other questions, I believe we're going to be wrapping things up in a few moments. Okay, going once, going twice.
Hey, before we go,
Oh, were you
if
able
you want to have
to?
a quick conversation, my underlay has miraculously started working. I thought that might happen, but I didn't want to hunt and peck while we were talking. So before I let you folks go, I'm just going to run through underlay real quick. And I'm not going to spend as much time as we were because we're pretty deep into our webinar now. But just so I can go through it for you real quick. When you're doing small letters, you want to kind of take it easy on how much underlay you put in. So right now you can see that I've applied a center walk underlay. What that means is the software is going to run a line of stitching right through the center of the letter. This works very well for smaller letters. When you do something like a zigzag underlay, okay, you can see what's happening here, and we've added a zigzag stitch underneath the letters. Now, this seems counterintuitive because you might think that you're building up a very good foundation underneath the letters. While that is true, you've actually just tripled the amount of underlay, because what happens is the software has to move around to get to where it needs to get to create the underlay. So you'll see that there's actually 2 layers of center walk under here and here, and the zigzag stitch. So you're adding quite a bit of stitches at the same time you're adding underlay. If your letters are larger, and especially if you're stitching on top of things like a polar fleece or a terry cloth towel, the zigzag underlay can be very, very helpful, okay, in keeping the letters on top of the fabric. Another choice that you'll see in your underlay selections is something called an edge walk. Steve hates edge walks. This is just a personal preference, but what you'll see with an edge walk is it actually does a center walk down the middle, and then it'll put another underlay on either side of the center line. For small letters, it's highly likely that your that your edge walk underlay will start to poke out either side when you actually start doing your embroidery, which is a bad thing. But when you're doing larger letters, again, edge walk can be nice. Some people love it, some people hate it. I find that for small letters, I don't like to use it. So if you see it there, it might, on small letters, I would avoid it. Double zigzag, again, this one shows exactly what you think it would show. It's doing a double zigzag underneath. This is, again, not recommended for small letters, but if you're doing large letters, let's say an inch or larger, double zigzag might come in handy.
Okay,
So I did just want to go over those things real quickly now that it was working properly. I'm a little bit embarrassed. I don't
brilliant,
know why it wasn't working a minute ago, but it's working now.
brilliant. Thank you very much, Steve. I believe I'd seen a hand going up and then it switched off. If you've got your question, please raise your hand once again. Yes, um, please feel free to ask your question.
His microphone is turned off.
Yes, as I just asked him to unmute. There you go. John, you can ask your questions. He's not muted. You're permitted to speak.
Don't
Otherwise,
be
please type
shy.
it in. Don't be shy. Otherwise, you could just type it in. Yes, I believe John might be having some technical difficulties. John, feel free to type your question. And if anyone else has a question, please ask it now. And I will switch on your microphone. No, John, I'm very sorry. It seems like you're unable to ask a question, which is a shame. Okay. John, yes, please. We still can't hear John.
We have a question from an anonymous attendee that reads, have had some difficulty on embroidering serif fonts like Times New Roman in sizes less than 0.25. Any suggestions here? You're not going to like my answer. It's going to be don't use Times New Roman at sizes less than 0.25. It's just that font is not well suited to small text.
Very, very small.
I mean, a little while ago, I used that phrase. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. This one falls squarely into that category. If you are going to use a serif font like Times New Roman at that size, then you have to become an expert at density and pull compensation considerations. It's absolutely vital at that size. It's like not goofing around.
Right. Now we've got one from John. He says, for pull compensation, more on thicker fabrics such as canvas or structured caps. That's basically what he wrote there. Pull comp on thick fabrics.
Okay, can you restate the question?
That's all he wrote. Forgive me. He just wrote for pull comp. I suppose he wants to know a little bit more if you want to use full compensation on thicker fabrics such as canvas or a structured cap.
Okay, so that's actually a very good question. It's also very insightful. So one thing that's important to remember about pull compensation is what you're trying to do is take into account how much the fabric is actually going to stretch. Okay, so if you're going to be embroidering on a fabric that does not have a lot of stretch to it, call it a canvas or a broadcloth or something like a nylon jacket, okay? If you actually pull on those fabrics, you'll see that they don't have a great deal of stretch. If your fabric does not have a great deal of stretch, you may or may not want to add any pull compensation at all, okay? Because in those cases, since that fabric is not going to stretch, it very well may not need any pull compensation considerations. It becomes what you see is what you get. Now, you might want to add a little bit just because aesthetically, a little bit heavier letter might look nicer, but from a technical standpoint, you don't need it. So there really always are two considerations when creating stock lettering or digitizing logos. There's two considerations. There's technical as well as aesthetic. Okay. kind of what I've been talking about today really falls a little bit more into the technical category as opposed to the aesthetic.
Okay, brilliant. And Demaray is just asking if we're going to share the webinar. Yes, you'll be able to see. You'll get an email where you could watch the webinar afterwards online. So thank you very much. Do we have any other questions before we come to a close? Okay, I believe that's it for today. Steve, thank you very much as ever for your insights in embroidery digitizing, and thank you to everyone who attended today, and we look forward to seeing you again in the near future. Thank you very much. Have a lovely day.
Thanks, guys.